Hello and welcome to another podcast from Dell Technology. Today we're fortunate enough to be joined by Professor Nick James, Professor of Bladder Cancer and Prostate Cancer, who works at the Royal Marsden and at the Institute of Cancer Research. Hello, Professor James.
Hi, good afternoon. Nice to be talking to you.
Good to talking to you as well. If you wouldn't mind telling the audience about your professional background and how it is you ended up where you are today, please.
Okay, so yes, I'm a medic by primary training, but I've also got a science degree in immunology and a PhD in sort of cell cycle biology from Imperial College. I clinically specialize in prostate and bladder cancer, and I'm a clinical oncologist, which is a sort of rather UK specific thing, which means I'm in essence dual trained in medical oncology and radiation oncology. And I spent most of my consultant career in Birmingham as a consultant and a professor in the university. And I moved to the Institute of Cancer Research, which is a postgraduate college of the University of London, about 4 years ago. And clinically, I now work at the Royal Marsden Hospital, which is the sort of NHS partner of the ICR. So that's where I do my clinical work.
Okay, fantastic. I understand that one of your many achievements was the man van. I'm quite interested and how that unfolded. Could you tell the audience a bit about that, please?
Yeah, so this arose, as a lot of things do, by complete chance, really. Around 10 years ago, a Jamaican patient walked into my clinic in Birmingham, and he had presented in urinary retention from the prostate cancer that eventually, sadly, took his life. And there was a number of things like this. One, he was a musician, and he said, "Oh, I'll get some of my mates to do a concert to raise money for you." And his mates turned out to include some absolutely amazing musicians. Then he himself was an amazing musician. And the striking thing about the concerts was that we got substantially Black audiences, and subsequent to those, we started seeing more Black patients being referred into my clinic, and they're very consistent in saying, "Oh, one of my friends came to your concert, or my dad, or whoever, my son came to one of your concerts," and I realised that I had issues that needed to be addressed. And the relevant bit of biology here is that prostate cancer is twice as common in Black men, and also more likely to present at a more advanced stage. And the clear message from these concerts was that there was an unmet educational need. The Black community was not aware, well, some were obviously, but were often not aware of this increased risk. But also, there was clearly an education about how you got, what sorts of things to look out for, and how you got access to treatment. So off the back of that, we came across a separate thing, being through Johnny's wife, who was a trade union official with Unite, and Unite were running health checks in collaboration with National Express using an old converted bus. So we thought, well, we'll just combine these two things into the man van. And so we raised over the subsequent few years around £500,000 and used it to fund the purchase of the van, and it was intended to fund the running of the van as well in Birmingham. In the meantime, I moved to London, and that coincided more or less with the COVID pandemic starting, and that completely, essentially destroyed Birmingham's ability to collaborate with it. They just had a miserable time with COVID. But the Marsden and the ICR were much more interested in and had the bandwidth to run the project. So we essentially transferred the van physically to London and started running it via the ICR and the Marsden through the West London Cancer Alliance. So that's how we got to where we are now with it. So it's a slightly tortuous story, quite a long route to where we started.
So tell me, do Black men have a greater predisposition to bladder cancer and prostate cancer?
Just prostate cancer. It's roughly double the risk of white men, prostate cancer in Black men compared to white men. And there is a debate as to whether it's actually also more aggressive in Black men. I think my view is it probably is a bit more aggressive in Black men than white men. So not only are they more likely to get it, they're certainly more likely to present with advanced disease, but that's not necessarily the biology of the disease. That might be kind of social, cultural factors resulting in people presenting late. There's a whole range of reasons why people present late with things as opposed to present early. But it's a very consistent finding worldwide. So that very strongly suggests there's an underlying genetic basis to it. It's not an environmental thing because it's consistent across multiple different environments.
And is the van still used in Croydon?
So where we got so the plan with the van was that it's a three-way intervention. It's an education thing. So we've been using it essentially as a big advert for itself. It's a large blue thing with writing, advertises itself on the side. And we went through various routes, community groups, through black churches, through the Croydon Council. And then the thing that turned out to work best was working through GP practices in the areas that we targeted. And we basically, if you like, socio-demographically targeted GP practices. So we went and looked for areas of high deprivation or with high ethnic minority populations. The increased risk of presenting late is not exclusive to black men, of course. It's a common feature in all ethnic minorities and in areas of high deprivation, and those overlap to a degree, not completely, of course. So we picked areas where we know there were high rates of late diagnosis driven by those factors. And essentially, the model we hit on was that we sent out texts via GPs to men in the target age range and said, come in for a health check. And so there was a number of, plus we did sort of linked outreach through community groups in the same areas. And so we ran a one-year pilot, which finished last December. And we got about 800 men through the van for the pilot. So it was quite slow to start with and accelerated towards the end. And so a number of very interesting findings. One was that around half the people that we ended up getting through the van were from ethnic minorities. And one of the interesting things about this is roughly double the rate of ethnic minorities in the populations that we were targeting with our messaging. And it's very unusual. If you look at clinical trials, they are almost always overwhelmingly white. So ethnic minorities are very consistently underrepresented in clinical trials worldwide. So to have the reverse phenomenon where we've got ethnic minorities overrepresented tells us something very interesting about the targeting and the fact that it worked. That if you explain to people you in particular have an increased risk for these reasons, and this is the way to get a health check relating to them, the message was clearly penetrating.
I think the thing that really astounded me about the van, and I think one of the reasons it could be looked at as a national program, is that during the progress of this operation, you were able to pick up undiagnosed cases of hypertension and diabetes. And that was remarkable.
Yeah. So one of the things that we hit on quite early on with the man van was from the previous work that United done in Birmingham, was that I went to spend a morning in one of the Birmingham Central bus depots, and there was just any amount of pathology walking into the bus. And it wasn't that people didn't know they had problems, they did. But basically, if you're, say, for example, your work as a cleaner in Birmingham Central bus depot, you're on very unsociable hours, you're on a low income. If you take time off, you lose, go for a check, you lose money. But what's more, if you go to your GP and say, I'm a bit worried about my general health, can you give me a health check? The GP won't even see you. So whilst if you work for a big sort of finance or legal firm, health checks will come as part of the package of things, and there's a reason for that. It's a nice perk. The people who have the worst health are the ones that are least likely to get health checks. So we figured there was no point in just having the van and just doing prostate PSA tests. It was made much more sense to do a range of other health checks. So we did a whole load of, we piloted in the pilot, we did a whole load of checks, and the things, as you rightly say, that picked up the biggest numbers were the blood pressure checks and the diabetes checks. So 25% at least had undiagnosed hypertension, and another 15% or so had undiagnosed diabetes or pre-diabetes. So these are both things that would untreated are life-shortening and are treatable / even preventable. If you change your diet, you can reverse progress to type 2 diabetes. So so we felt, and then on top of that, the rates of prostate cancer we picked up were around about 3% of the men that we tested had prostate cancer. Now, if you do a PSA test, in PSA screening trials, where you just take the whole population and do a PSA test, around 1% will have prostate cancer. So we picked up 3 times the rate. So we don't fully understand why, but we think that there's a number of factors at play. One is the ethnic mix. By having more black men, we had a higher pickup rate. But also we think a number of the cancers we picked up because people came in and they said, I've got a really strong family history. My dad, my uncle, my brother have all got prostate cancer. And so we referred those men in as well. And so a significant number of our prostate cancer diagnoses came in because people had strong family histories and nothing else. So it's, there's a number of interesting things around this. So off the back of that, we were interacting with NHS England around this, and there's a big backlog of undiagnosed cancer cases, including prostate cancer cases, off the back of the pandemic. And NHS England have been very interested in addressing this. And they commissioned a number of projects, ours being one of them, to explore ways of addressing these sorts of health inequalities, which were there anyway, but which have been exacerbated by COVID. And so we're now funded for another year to do a much larger scale project. So we have more staff, and we've slimmed down our appointment templates to essentially the 3 things that have the biggest pickup rate: hypertension, diabetes, and prostate cancer. So we're now seeing about 100 men a week for a year. So it'll be of the order of 4,000 men that we will run through the van over the course of the year. And then we're doing some other interesting things, I think, with it, which is that there are tools called polygenic risk scores. So you take a DNA sample, saliva, whatever, and you can estimate what somebody's lifetime risk is of prostate cancer from their background DNA. So it's kind of a lab test way of finding out your family history, if you like. And so we've just done a partnership with a genomics company to fund us doing 300 men's polygenic risk scores. So normally this is something that will cost you a few £1,000s privately, not available any other way. So it's quite a substantial amount of funding that we've pulled in that way. And we'll be able to see to what extent we can enhance our diagnostic rate by identifying the men at highest risk of prostate cancer from their genetic background. So that we've just got ethical approval to start that. And that's in collaboration with other colleagues at the Institute of Cancer Research, who are particularly a lady called Rod Eales, who's one of the world's leading experts on prostate cancer genetics. So we're very excited about that. I think it's potentially going to show us some very interesting outcomes.
Professor James, do you think you'll get continued funding for the project over the next few years?
Well, a very interesting question. We're currently grappling with that. So we've got a number of options as to what to do when the current year runs out in early next year. So one is we just give the van back, because the van is actually owned by the charity in Birmingham that I raised the money for in the first place. The second is that we and just call it a day. The second is that we come to some sort of arrangement with them to carry on using it. And the third is that we buy our own. Now, we're currently sort of scoping out our options on that. But separately from that, the point of the pilot via NHS England is to assess whether this is a clinically and a cost-effective way of diagnosing cancer. So NHS England who are monitoring this closely, will come to their own view as to whether every cancer alliance in the country should be commissioning something similar. But inevitably, there'll be a gap between us finishing the project and then analysing the data and then coming to a conclusion about funding. So I don't think, but I don't know, that we'll get more funding necessarily straight away from NHS England. It's possible they might decide while the project is running that the data is so persuasive that they want to carry on funding it anyway. But we're also exploring other options, because the thing is an incredibly powerful fundraising and awareness raising tool. And so for example, we there's a foundation called the Bob Willis Fund. So Bob Willis was an English cricketer who died of prostate cancer in his either late 50s or early 60s, and he's an England cricket captain. First Ashes test, they gave over one of the days to prostate cancer awareness in his memory, and we took the van to Edgbaston and did a whole load of interviews, and including one on Sky that went out to 5 million people. And as you might imagine, that generates a lot of donations. So the thing is, potentially self-fundable through that route anyway. Using that sort of leverage, the charity, our own, the hospital and the Institute of Cancer Research's brand name, if you like. But actually, really, what we want to do with it is show that it's a useful model, because the problem with cancer diagnosis is that in order for you to get diagnosed with cancer, you've got to notice there's something wrong, and then you've got to go to your GP, get an appointment to see the GP, and persuade the GP that you need investigation. And that sort of model is stacked against people with less money and less education, because they're less aware of what symptoms they may need to get investigated, and it's more difficult for them to take time off work to access the GPs, and there are fewer GPs per head of population in the more deprived bits of the UK. So everything is stacked against you. So a model where you proactively go out after the people who into the areas where people are likely to present late problems, and proactively find them and make it easy for them to get appointments, and then directly refer them in, so they don't have to go via the GPs at all. And I have to say, we've designed the current model in collaboration with ourselves, up in competition with them. They themselves are very aware that this is a problem for them and for their patients, so they've been very supportive and very helpful. And we think it offers a sort of a complementary route into NHS cancer diagnosis that is, I think, a huge unmet need. And probably because, going back to the blood pressure and diabetes points, probably the same applies to other conditions as well, not just prostate cancer.
Absolutely. You mentioned earlier in the conversation that the Cancer Alliances are those people in the United Kingdom who commission services.
Correct.
So there are, I don't know how many Cancer Alliances there are in the UK, but they would then commission your van. Is that what you're saying? That's potentially a possibility?
Yeah, well, I think there's various ways you could do this. I mean, we've done it with a van, and actually the NHS England pilot, there's a second van that they've commissioned in the Manchester area. It's doing essentially the same thing. But there's been other things where they've just done it through GP surgeries, through health centres. There's other examples in the past. People have done it through pop-up shops. I mean, there's any amount of pop-up shops available nowadays, on high streets and stuff. So there's various. It's more the principle of proactively engaging with people at high risk of problems, and that problems that are more amenable to treatment if you pick them up early. And so I think it's the triad of education, access, and then rapid referral for problems that you find is the three features. Now, there's a number of ways you can deliver it, the van being one. But yes, you would envisage, like for West London, you could have a rolling programme with a couple of vans just going around the boroughs, in rotation, and indefinitely. But yes, you'd need to commission a fleet of them, not just one, clearly.
Okay, no problems at all. So I know that you've been involved in many interesting clinical trials in your lifetime, a couple of profound clinical trials where you've made a difference to, if not hundreds of thousands of lives, not just in the UK, but across the world. Would you like to describe any of the interesting trials that you've been involved in? Because there is quite a few, but anything that really sticks in your mind?
Yeah, so there's two I'd like to highlight. So sticking with prostate cancer, there's the STAMPEDE trial. So STAMPEDE was designed by myself and a number of other collaborators around 20 years ago. And around that time, there hadn't been any change at all in the prognosis of prostate cancer since the 1940s, when it was first described that androgen deprivation would put advanced cancers into remission. And the thing that happened 20 years ago was that for the first time, literally since the 40s, there were drugs appearing in the clinic that actually appeared to impact people's prognosis. And the striking thing was that all of these things were being tested in men with relapsed disease who had short periods of time to live. And that was the first thing. And then the second thing was that there was no single bet buy, as it were. There was no single thing that was most worth testing. And then the third thing was, we thought, well, why wait till people are in the terminal stages to try out new treatments? Let's try them out in newly diagnosed patients. They have the most to benefit. And so we designed this trial that had multiple arms to it, because we couldn't pick a single thing we wanted to try over the others. So we ended up with 5 different experimental arms and very, very broad inclusion criteria. So anybody starting long-term hormone therapy and deprivation of prostate cancer was essentially eligible for it. And it turned out to be, I have to say, a rip-roaring success, because to start with, we got the reviewers were saying, oh, it's far too complicated, nobody will understand it, clinicians will get confused, patients will get even more confused, it'll fail. And it turned out the opposite was true. Patients were super keen, because if you think about it, if you've been diagnosed with incurable cancer, going in a trial where you've got 5 chances out of 6 of getting a new treatment is very attractive. Yet just getting the standard treatment is very unattractive, because it's got a very standard outcome. So it was very popular with patients, but even more surprisingly, to be honest, it was very popular with clinicians as well. But I think with hindsight, for the same reasons, you know, trying out new things in an otherwise dismal circumstance is appealing. So the trial recruited extremely fast, and then as we were running it, new treatments started appearing, and we had the, I think, quite novel idea of, instead of starting a new trial for your new treatment, we just added the new treatment to the same trial. So we started with 5 experimental treatments. We've since added 5 more, and along the way, most of those have now read out and given us answers. Altogether, we actually finally closed the current platform this year with 12,000 men recruited across the 10 different treatments that we've tried. Of the 10 treatments that we've tried, 2 haven't reported results yet. Of the other 8, 6 of those have brought about improvements in survival. So, I mean, it's not, other people have done trials in the same newly diagnosed space since, but we were essentially first into that space, and by far the biggest trial in the space. And I think it's fair to say survival of prostate cancer is approximately double globally off the back of this trial. I mean, and the other trials, I can't claim sole credit for this, of course, but, we've made a substantial contribution to the literature on, on advanced prostate cancer. But also the trial design itself, the whole paradigm is novel, not just the results. So we're just...
It was a fantastic success for you, for everybody.
Yeah, for everybody. Yeah, everybody wins. Patients win. It recruited in every single oncology centre in the UK. So one of the great things about when we presented results was that we got instant buy-in because everybody contributed to it. So it was facilitated hugely by the setting up of the National Cancer Research Institute and network. And it's been rather sad, actually, that recently that's been pretty substantially undermined, and the National Cancer Research Network National Cancer Research Institute has just been shut down. So the government is having had this fantastic structure set up 20 years ago, is it's busy trashing it, to be honest. It's been very painful to watch, and to the point that the government has actually realised it's done this. They've just commissioned a report into clinical trials focused on commercial trials, which has pointed out essentially what I just said, which is that we had a fantastic infrastructure and you trashed it and you need to rebuild it. And so that,
and the second trial you referred to?
So second trial, completely different thing in bladder cancer. So in bladder cancer, if you've got disease invading into the muscle of the bladder wall, standard treatment globally is to remove the bladder. And fairly uniquely, in the UK, there's always been a culture of, instead of taking the bladder out, doing radiotherapy, and then only taking the bladder out if the radiotherapy doesn't work. But the problem is if you just give radiotherapy on its own, it doesn't work about half the time. So, so that's not great odds, really, coin toss as to whether you keep your bladder or not. And so the trial that we did built on trials carried out in other diseases where it was known that if you added low-dose chemotherapy to radiotherapy, you made the radiotherapy work much better. So we did what is still the largest randomized trial in muscle-invasive bladder cancer. And what we showed was that if you added really low toxicity chemotherapy, you can literally give it to pretty much anybody. And the chemotherapy on its own does virtually nothing, both in terms of side effect or effect on the cancer, but it just sensitizes the cancer cells to radiation, that we halve the risk of your cancer coming back in the bladder. So it was a huge effect. And so that has driven, again, globally, a big shift in perception as to the safety of bladder preservation as an alternative to surgery. Because in addition to showing that you could hugely reduce the recurrence rate, we also showed that the quality of life, i.e. the function in the bladder you retained, was good. Because there had previously been a perception amongst surgeons, well, yes, maybe you can save the bladder with radiotherapy, but you just end up with a shriveled up small bladder that doesn't work very well, and we may as well have taken it out in the first place. But actually what we were able to show was that was just straightforwardly untrue. The functioning of the bladder you preserved was nigh on normal. Most patients report no disruption in urinary function 6 months on and beyond. So that's the other thing. So bladder cancer is a bit of a sort of Cinderella cancer. It's very under-researched, but actually is quite a lethal cancer. And the kind of a link between that and the man van is that it's a cancer linked to smoking and poverty, industrial exposure, chemical exposure, and bad health habits. And there's no sort of sexy lobby group for those sorts of people.
No, that's what always amazed me. There isn't a lobby group.
Yeah. And the same with the man van and the way we've targeted it. We're targeted on areas of high health inequality as a means of addressing inequality of outcome.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that. I would probably what would you say would be the most revolutionary therapy that you've seen in the last few years for bladder and prostate cancer?
I think for prostate cancer that has been the most surprising thing is that so when I started my career, it was already old news that androgen deprivation made cancers go into remission but didn't cure them. Now, what was really surprising was that when drugs started to be developed that would target relapsed prostate cancer, to everybody's surprise, they were targets that related to the androgen receptor pathway. So the cancers were not resistant to hormone therapy. They just kind of adapted themselves a bit, and they were still being driven by the same androgen pathways. And to a substantial degree, one of the things the cancer cells were doing was synthesizing their own androgen. So yeah, they were sort of auto-stimulating themselves. And so that, to me, really surprising piece of biology then led to a whole suite of drugs which have transformed the prognosis of prostate cancer. So the prototype was abiraterone, which was developed at the ICR where I'm currently sat. But there's a whole range of other drugs as well. It's not the only one. And so that, I think, has been absolutely game-changing in prostate cancer. And it's also opened the door to sort of more molecularly targeted therapies. So it's like a proof of concept that worked spectacularly well. In bladder cancer, I think the thing that has been the most revolutionary, but which is not still fully played through, was in a lot of cancers, it's been known for more than a century that sometimes the immune system would somehow latch itself on to an advanced cancer and it would just melt away. So it's been that, there's this known sort of miracle factor that, some patients miraculously survive apparently incurable cancers. And it's been long known that was in some way mediated by the immune system. And loads and loads of trials over the last century, more than a century, have focused on trying to stimulate the immune system. And they pretty much uniformly didn't work. And the insight for which the scientists got a Nobel Prize, was that the problem was not that the immune system wasn't being stimulated enough, but it was the reverse. It was that the cancer cells were applying the brakes. So the accelerator was pushed down, but so were the brakes. And so these, a whole class of drugs called immune checkpoint inhibitors were developed that essentially take the brakes off the immune system and allow the immune system to attack the cancer. Now, this is a sort of generic feature of all cancers, but in the field of bladder cancer, the immune checkpoint inhibitors are essentially the first drugs approved for bladder cancer that improve prognosis, licensed in about 40 years. So, whereas in other, they work in a whole range of other diseases, but in bladder cancer, they were the first thing that really worked to any worthwhile extent over the course of my career. All the chemotherapy tools were already in place when I qualified. So, so that's the thing in bladder cancer. But there's still more to be worked out on how these things can be made to work better. But that was a big step change. No, just one of the other things that we're very interested in with the Man-Van model is everything I said about late presentation, lack of knowledge, and all the rest of it. It applies like 100-fold if you go to low and middle income countries. So for the specific thing of prostate cancer, I've just been chairing a commission for the Lancet journal on prostate cancer, and the remit of the commission is to look at trends in prostate cancer and what the issues are going to be over the coming decade or so, and with a global perspective, not a UK perspective. And the thing's still it's now in the final stages of drafting and editing with the Lancet, and we'll launch it probably at one of the big urology conferences next spring. But anyway, the key thing is that prostate cancer is going to roughly double. So there's about 1.4 million cases of prostate cancer annually worldwide at the moment. That's going to go up to somewhere near 3 million by 2040. And the reason for that is that if you take a country like Nigeria, they've got an increased risk because of their ethnicity. The current median age in Nigeria is 15. So there's not very many 60-year-olds in Nigeria. There's lots of 15-year-olds. But in 15 years' time, there'll be a lot more 60-year-olds because generally healthcare is getting better. And life expectancy is going up. And because of the age structure of the population being predominantly younger people, in 15 years' time, the bulge shifts and there'll be far more older people. Therefore, they are bound to see more prostate cancer, lots more. And that applies across the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. And it also applies across places like Brazil with exactly the same reasons. And so there's going to be a massive increase in the number of cases, and the healthcare systems are simply not geared up to it at all. And so things like mobile education testing linked to treatment projects are a potentially viable way of addressing that unmet need, because things like the Man-Van are essentially nurse, and we're not delivering it through doctors, we're delivering it through nurses and clerical staff. You don't need high-level training to do it. And a general feature, the reason we're doing it in the UK, but it applies even more so elsewhere, is that if you pick things up early enough, they're much easier to treat than if you pick them up late. So whilst, yes, the Man-Van we think is a very interesting thing for the UK, we think it's potentially an even more interesting thing in low and middle income countries, particularly middle income countries where life expectancy is rising and age structures are going to change a lot over the coming decades.
When are you expecting to announce that?
We are currently planning to launch it at the European Urology Association, which I think is March next year. I
love the Man-Van. I absolutely love the Man-Van. And I think putting this into populations anywhere in the world where it can be of use is a wonderful thing. All right. Well, look, I wanted to thank you very much for your time today. You've been wonderful. It's been fascinating to listen to you.